Thank you for joining us on the Downing Cut. My next guest is a seasoned film composer, sound designer, and record producer with nearly 30 years of experience in mixing, mastering, and music production for film and records across various genres. Passionate about his collaboration, he also mentors emerging composers and filmmakers, sharing his expertise in sound placement, audio recording, and voiceover production through lectures and teaching. Please welcome to the Downing Cut, Mike Hall. How are you, Mike?
Hey, how you doing?
Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And I feel like this is my own bias, but I feel like anyone that deals with music is like a genius. So I just want you to know I think you're a genius already.
Oh, well, thank you.
Because I think it,
Thank
it
you.
does take a special skill and knowledge. I mean, it's just like I look at it as, you have these engineers, software engineers that are coders, but you are also an engineer when it comes to sound, design, and understanding how music affects people. And so I'm so thankful for you to have you on here.
Oh,
And I've actually met some composers who have invited on the channel, but because they wanted to get into film, and they haven't done that yet, and they kind of bowed out being interviewed because they haven't had. And I'm like, but just come on, we'll interview you, and then people get to know you, and that's how it starts, you know. So,
yeah.
so Mike, tell us, how did your journey start?
Well, actually, I, my parents were always, they always had records and we were always listening to music. And when I was younger, I love movies, I remember, you know, going to see Star Wars when it first came out in the theater. And of course, that changed everything. But I really never thought about being like a film composer because I thought that, oh, those are for those educated music types. And I'm more along the lines of, music is art, and art, we have no rules here. So it was really probably back in the late 80s, mid 80s. I was, I bought a junky guitar, and, I wanted to be in rock bands. I wanted to sing for my rock and metal band. So I never thought about movies after that and that's how I got into recording. It was like, well, my band was too poor to ever, go and record in a real studio. So I built a studio and, produced my band's records. And then after a while, I was producing records for other bands. And then after that, I started doing mixing and mastering for record labels. And then one day I got contacted by a German filmmaker who was doing a horror film. And he was like, hey, I want you to score my film. And I'm like, well, how am I going to pull that out of my butt? But I did it. And, you know, I, I think earlier something told me about it, but I didn't pay attention to it. I was in another studio mixing a record, and I had created like a creepy intro to the start of the album. And the guy who happened to be the mix engineer turned around and he goes, you ought to do music for scary movies. I'm like, what? Nah, those are for those educated musician types, and I ain't that. So, and then years later, I got that offer and I did it, and I've been doing films ever since. And it's been, about 30 years. And, I'm still, trying to figure out, hoping that I know what I'm doing, but, not letting the client know that, of course. But uh, still going on we have no rules here.
See,
But uh, as you go along, you develop things at work and, you understand, like I said, what works and what kind of doesn't. So,
having no rules is kind of the mindset of a genius. You don't have these boundaries. Think about it. You grow up, as we're kids, we learn all these things, and as you become adults, it's a lot of people are saying we got to unlearn everything because you've put so many
Yeah.
restraints on yourself to be free. And but now you're educated and you're helping other people be educated by teaching and lecturing and
You
mentoring.
know, the thing of it is, like everybody's path is different. And so, it's like, um, you know, what the path that you start off on may not be the one that you end up. I thought about, well, I just wanted to, make my heavy metal records and travel around and tour, and you know that gets pretty old. That becomes grunt work, carrying big bass speakers up, flights of stairs because you can't afford roadies. And now it's kind of like, I'm old enough to where I just like, creating in my studio and, sending it out there. And the great thing about, the technology of today is that, our music is sent out through digital files. So that means you can work with people and film projects all over the world. And I think of it as, I'm working with musicians and filmmakers. The whole world is your palette, you know, from which to create from. And then you reach a point in your career where it's like, I've started thinking now, you know, it's important to inspire other people. And when you do that, that's that's our way of uh, our work and living on beyond us through the work of others, and that's a pretty cool idea, that I've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah. What
It's always never miss a chance to inspire others.
what is music producing? What does that look like? Is it because I know what film producing is, but what is it? What's involved in the producing of music?
For
Mhm.
film, you say?
Yeah.
I try to be as fluid as possible with the filmmaker. Sometimes they'll send me the script. Sometimes, they'll send me samples, whatever works, best for them. I honestly can start by speaking to the director about the film and some of the characters and the story. And within minutes, I'm already hearing ideas and themes, that would kind of fit with that. And then usually I'll put together some ideas, send it to the director, and then we try to get on the same page and weed out what they like and what they don't like. And um, it's really important to listen to what they want, and instead of saying, "Well, I'll tell you what I can do," I know exactly what you need for this. It's always best to just listen, and the more ideas and information that you can get from them, the less back and forth and the less work it is.
Are you also hiring other artists to collaborate with when you're creating music? Other musicians, I
I
should say.
do sometimes. So a lot of the films that I do are like in other countries, and they involve other cultures. And I learned early on, don't try to replicate something that um, you normally probably wouldn't do. Like a lot of different countries will say, okay, well, we want it Americanized, but we want our culture in it. So use instruments, and it's really hard to replicate something. Um, I prefer to make the music authentic. So a lot of times, for example, just recently, I worked on a film from India, and what I suggested is that they have local musicians, and then and they would record parts, and then I would create a score around them.
Oh, okay.
You know,
Yeah.
so there's an element of more authenticity to it than if I was to just replicate what I think would be, you know, something that should be more authentic. So also it's important to network with a lot of other artists that create music that, you know, is not what I would normally do, or other musicians, so that, again, you have a whole world of talent that you can draw from, you know, so that, adding on to that palette of talent and creativity you can draw from.
I think with nowadays you have synthesizers, digital sounds and stuff like that. Do you lean more towards, I mean, shoot, horror movies, do you lean towards more of digital sounds, or are you looking for more analog?
Um, I would love to work with more like orchestras and live musicians. The trouble with that is the budgets just aren't there. So most of the work is done with, synths, but I try to do it a hybrid approach, where I'll actually send I'll create some tracks and then I'll send them to like a cellist or a violinist, and they can do a few overdubs on it, so that even on the smallest budgets, if you have one, live instrument, that really, you know it really makes it sound better. you know Synthesizers have come a long ways, but it just will never, it's never, you've got the sample of the sound, and it is a real sample of the sound. But one of the things that's missing is the environment, like, the air that the instrument pushes,
Hmm.
um, to give it that realistic element. So when you blend the two, it sounds, you can still create a more realistic element.
So I'm looking at your IMDb. You have previous 20 films that you were a composer of, 25 that you've been a composer of. What You've seen a lot of films, you've seen a lot of actors, and just from your perspective, I always ask everyone this: is what qualities or skills do you believe set an exceptional actor apart from the rest?
I think the important thing is the believability. You know, um, I know a lot of big films. They try to get in big names, but to me, it's like I'd rather see no name people, or unknowns, because that, if I'm watching a film, I want the story to be believable. I don't want familiar faces, that tell me that it's a film, kind of. Um, um, Going back to, um, like Star Wars originally, you know, he used they were known actors, but they weren't so well known, you know, to the main audience. And so, you know, I think, um, there's a sense of realism there, with the story and the characters.
When you look at your approach to composing for film and had as it's evolved over the years, what are the main differences that you've seen or different approaches that you've kind of sharpened from your own
I
experience?
I think the nowadays, it's kind of exciting because now it's more experimental. You're using, instead of like, a lot of orchestra, you're using, created sounds, more sound design, and the score doesn't necessarily have to be what would be traditionally thought of as music, but more whatever enhances the emotions of that moment or that scene. The other thing I notice is that on the downside of it, I see a lot of new composers where they feel they have to make, you know, everything that I make has to be this giant epic sound. And the truth of it is, 99% of all the gigs that you'll probably ever get will never have that sound. They're just like a distant piano, or, um, soft strings that only are there not to be noticed, but to only enhance the visual, you know, um, or there's different ways, like it's meant to enhance what the audience is feeling, or what the character is feeling, or the environment. And a lot of that doesn't have to be traditional music. It can be just various sounds. And one thing that we notice in a lot of films these days is that one of the most impactful sounds that you can get in a film is actually just silence. You know, where it'll work both in like suspense and even comedies, where uh, you know the scene will get to this climax moment, and you're where you would normally hear this great loud cymbal crash. Now it's dead silence, and you're hearing like the actors breathing, and then it goes into the you know where the music really isn't so much the climax anymore as it is silence, and that's pretty cool.
What what is the difference between, I mean, when you say sound design and then you say a film composer, is that same? Or is that the same umbrella? Or how does that work?
Well, the composer is more about the music for it. The sound designer is um, more about, okay, I've got um, this monster. What does this monster sound like? And then you've got the Foley, which is, okay, the car door opening, or the footsteps. Um, but these days, I think a lot of people lump it all together,
Okay.
and maybe it's because of the budget, where the composer has ended up doing everything, including the mixing, and
Is that you then? Is that what you're
there's a
doing?
lot of there's so many people that are involved in the various sounds, um, you know, and then a lot of times these days, like with smaller budgets, it's like, well, can you do, for example, recently I had done I was going to do music for a sci-fi film, and they said, well, we need you to do the sound design. I said, oh, sci-fi, that should be fun. So I did that, and then it turned into, oh yeah, um, we lost the Foley guy. Can you do the Foley? Like, uh, well, okay. Yeah, the mixer, I don't know, they took off. So could you mix it too? So I prefer to do just the music, but I thought, yeah, maybe it's good to try to, you know, learn all these others and find out that I don't want to do those, but um, I mean, they're all their own skills and talents.
Yeah. Is mixing, is that more involved of the volume and right and left and channel and
Yeah,
okay, and balancing that out
yeah,
with the dialogue?
yeah. So like if you hear an actor to the right, you would have it the voice panned a little more to the right, that type of thing.
Okay. What do you believe is the most overlooked aspect of sound design in film?
Mm, well, not so much that it's overlooked, but I believe probably less is more. You know, it seems like, and I sound like some old guy, but I'm thinking, when I go to the movies, I'm thinking, wow, that's loud. The music is just too loud, and then my wife's got earplugs in her purse for me. But I'm thinking, the music shouldn't be noticed that much. You know, I always tell other composers that, hey, if you want your music to be heard in this, make an album instead.
Mm.
Because a film is, you know, uh, just a combination of hundreds of different really talented people and all the various talents that they do. And the most important thing is the visual and the characters and the dialogue. And, the music is just there to, enhance that. If the person is if the audience is paying attention to the music, then and not to the dialogue, there's something not right there,
Yeah.
you know. So I think what's overlooked is what's done too much, maybe.
What are your thoughts? And this is my personal question because I know I've heard both sides when watching film, but sometimes you'll hear dialogue and you won't hear any music. And there are other films that I'll hear dialogue and I hear music behind that. You have a
Mm.
preference?
Well, like again, I prefer um, the music should never disrupt the dialogue.
Yeah.
You know, if even the best music, if I'm sitting there and I'm listening to or watching the film and I hear, oh, that's pretty music. What did she
Yeah.
say? You
Yeah.
know, then there's something went wrong there, because maybe it's only me where I can only focus on one thing at a time. But as humans, we want to we're more comfortable focusing on one thing at a time. And so I'm more less is more type of music person.
Mhm.
Uh, you really, and you can, I oftentimes, a new filmmaker will want music in every scene, you know,
Guilty.
constantly. And I'm like, you know, sometimes when you have too much, then it takes the specialness away from it, you know. Uh, you really don't have to have that. Some people will be like, well, we only want music, during scene changes or, after a dramatic effect or as we're entering a scene, and then the music goes off and then there's dialogue. But again, you know, I really can't say how things should be because I believe there's no rules in this. It's up to the director and the filmmaker. It's their vision, their creative ideas. I'm just saying what I've kind of noticed, and a lot of times they'll send a script and say, well, where would you suggest the music be? And a lot of it is just the feel of it.
Mm.
And if there's lots of dialogue, you don't need that. You don't. It's only there to enhance.
That's, I hear you in that aspect because that's kind of what I thought. And, I did that. I put in music with the film, with the dialogue, because I was trying to push that emotional aspect of it. And it wasn't overbearing. I obviously did some ducking and toned it down, but it's just there, just enough to go to raise that bar
Right.
a little bit.
And also, I suggest if you do that, have very very simple music. Like let's say you've got um, like a romantic scene or something where there's lots of emotion, interaction with the characters. You don't want a really busy music track, you know. You want maybe one or two hits on a distant piano you always hear, with lots of reverb, so that there's a feel that adds to the pure emotion, but it doesn't it's in the background and it doesn't take away from the visual or what's being said.
That's good advice. How do you balance creativity with the technical precision required for mixing and mastering?
I try to um, I try to take the technical side out of it, and I used to be somebody who loved the gear, I got to spend a fortune on all this stuff. And then I've realized it's like, they're just tools, you know. That's all it is. And you got to go with emotion and um, how does it feel? If it's, again, there's no rules to it. Just go with how it feels, and, you know, fortunately, technology has made equipment more easier to use, and, so if possible, don't think about the gear or the technical side of it. Just think about, okay, the creativity part of it, you know.
Yeah. I think that's the fun part for me. What do you ever get tired of doing? Let's see. You said you had a sci-fi, but a lot of your films you've done have been horror. Do you get tired from that aspect?
Uh, well, you know, those were the majority of them that would come to me, and they always seem uh, natural to me. I like dramas. Um, the one thing that I don't really do is comedies, you know, because I'm thinking, well, there's so many ways to do that, to do a comedy. That was always, I love comedies. I love watching comedies, but as far as creating it, I usually pass it on to somebody else who does comedies. Now, the bad thing about always doing like music for horror films is that you really can't ever watch horror films after that. You know, once you've worked on them and you know how it's done, then you're thinking, oh well, that was a good idea. Yeah, I probably would have done that. You know, and you have to constantly be saying, geez, just shut up and watch the movie. You know, it's like recording audio recording. You know, once you do something like that, you never listen to music normally ever again. You're thinking, I think I heard that vocal edit, or I wonder what microphone they used on that snare drum. And I'm like, gee, just shut up and listen to the song, will you? Nobody cares, you know?
Yeah.
So it ruins you.
I did have a musician watch one of my films, and he was like, "Oh, so what happened to the room tone?" He just picked it up right away. You know, and I do the same thing with films. I'm looking at the angle, cinematography, the lighting, and just
Mhm.
dissecting it all, going, "Oh, okay,
Right, right.
yeah." What?
It ruins you.
I know. I try. I don't. My wife hasn't. She hasn't hit me over the head yet because I always, whenever we start watching something, I'm like, oh, something's gonna happen. you
Right, right.
Brace yourself. You can hear it. With the music and everything.
Yep.
So, can you share a particularly challenging film project that you had to overcome with sound-related obstacles?
Um, I would say those moments were early on when, when the director asked for like a style of music that I knew right away that, yeah, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that. But yeah, yeah, sure, I can do that. Yeah, we can do that. You know,
Just say yes.
that was that was a lesson where don't be honest with yourself. You know, if you're not going to be honest with the director and just say yes to everything, be honest to yourself, because if you if you try to take on everything, even the stuff that you don't do well, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. You know. Um, Shortly after that, I realized, okay, well, I've got to start networking with other artists that do what I don't do. You know, just in case those moments come up. Um, but it's also important, like I said, be honest with yourself. It's if it's not something that I mean, obviously we try to take on whatever jobs we can possibly get, but there's a lot to be said for saying no, and then passing it on to somebody else, or spreading the work around that, you may not do. So that was a big lesson that I had to kind of overcome is, be honest with what you can and can't do very well, you know.
Yeah.
Well,
Chew only what you can bite.
yeah.
What advice would you give to young composers about making their work stand out in the industry?
Um, Always be creating. Don't wait around for a job. Um, always, always be working on and learning and experimenting. Um, One of the biggest things doesn't even have anything to do with music at all, but it's just being very personable. Being a great listener, um, making making the director feel comfortable with you and what you do. You know, um, that's the one thing I always hear about from people is like, oh, we go to school to learn these skills and to be the best musician that you can be. But the biggest thing has nothing to do with music. It's learning to be a good car salesman, or really personable. You know, the one thing about this business is that um, if you, I notice about filmmakers is that if they work with somebody and they're really comfortable with working with them, they won't want to find anybody else. You know,
Hmm.
so and they usually keep working with that one person. You know, I mean, there's millions of composers out there, and I always suggest to filmmakers, network with as many filmmakers as you can because, you know, you can never have too many sound choices, but they're usually, I got a guy I work with and we work pretty well together and I'm not gonna reinvent the wheel here,
Hmm.
So be very personable and be very cool to work with.
Communication styles, right? Have you ever had a point where you created something for the director, they did a review, and it just went totally different direction than what you had thought?
There's there's been times where I thought when I worked with a director, I thought I totally get this. I totally get here's what you need. And then I would create it. And I thought for sure I'd be spot on. And then, the director would be like, yeah, that's really not what I had in mind. You know, which then goes to that other lesson. Get as much information, get links to samples of music that they're thinking. Um, uh, they're what always happens is I'm always thinking, oh, they're gonna hate this. They're gonna totally think this is not, and then and then they end up loving it. But whenever I get kind of too sure of myself, and thinking, yep, I got this one spot on. I know exactly. They're like, nah, we that's not what we had in mind there. So
Well, that's a lot of work too, right? When you're going in investing that much
yeah.
time to develop something new.
Uh, what I do is, I never think that it's a waste of time because I'm thinking, okay, well, if this project can't use this music, I'll just put it in the project or the production library and, I can license it somewhere.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, you're never wasting your time creating, even if it's not the right, what they're looking for, or, any time spent creating is good time. It's well worth it. But if you're doing a job, you want to save time for them and yourself and make sure that, everybody's on the right page and um, you know, get the sound as quickly as possible. for
how
them.
does that start? Are you starting off with like a melody or a feeling, and then once they give you the green light, then you just start adding more to it?
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, just like I said, just talking to them, I can kind of start hearing, what the score would kind of be like, and I'll start with that, just basic tracks, and I'll do some samples for them, and then I'll send it to them, and it'll either be, yeah, that sounds perfect, or it'll be like, yeah, that's not what we had in mind, you know. But getting that information up front as soon as possible. But yeah, I start hearing the ideas immediately,
That's awesome.
you know.
All right, so here's a heavy question for you because I know 25 films. How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it unique?
That can be tough sometimes. But each story, um, even if all you do is horror films, they're all different, even though there's elements are the same. Always try to keep experimenting, keep working on um, enhancing what it is that you do and try new things. Like I said, these days it's kind of nice because there's a lot of experimenting with sounds and non-musical things, uh, that makes it more experimental, more different, more interesting. So
Mike, what role do you see when it comes to AI and new technologies playing in the future of film composition and sound design?
I get asked that a lot, um, even to the point where I'll talk to a filmmaker and I'm asking them about, well, what are your ideas for music for this? And they're like, I'm just going to use AI music, you know.
Wow.
And I'll even have people ask me, hey, where where can I download free music? What sites would you recommend? I'm like, well, here's the thing, you know, that's a weird thing to ask a composer, but I got to be understanding.
That is a weird
If I
that is
was
very
just
weird
if I was just
to ask a
if I was
composer,
just
where can I get something for
yeah, it'd
free?
be like I describe it as going to the grocery store and asking where I can get free food at,
Yeah.
you know. But I have to be understanding, we all start somewhere. And you know, if you're starting out with filmmaking, you're probably not putting as much emphasis on music, or you're not going to put as much emphasis or spending on music. So you got to do what you got to do, to make your art happen for you. Um, I look at it as it's just simply a tool. You know, there's a lot of people that are saying, "Hey, their AI is going to take our jobs." Well, there was a time when people believed that synthesizers were going to take the work of orchestras, and a lot of times, uh, they outlawed on projects, no synthesizers. That's
Wow.
taken away the work from, orchestras. And honestly, it did kind of because, but the truth of it is most people can't afford a 60-piece orchestra,
Hmm.
but they can afford a synthesizer. You do what you have to do to make your art happen. If it comes down to, well, I'm not going to be a filmmaker. I'm not going to tell a story because I can't afford a 60-piece orchestra. I wouldn't want that to happen. You got to do what you got to do, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so AI, they're still in the beginning where they, you know, how to do all that. But I mean, if it makes music and it does what a new filmmaker needs it to do, um, one of the things that I do say about like uh, sound libraries is that um, it's perfect if you've got like a one-off song or just a few tracks that you need. Um, but it's but you'll never have the theme and flow of various tracks and mixes of a single theme that you would with a composer. And I would still suggest, go to a composer and say, hey, I don't have a whole lot, but can you create a theme and then maybe do various mixes or edits of that one theme, you know, for my film. And, you know, that's still maybe just as affordable as, doing a bunch of separate songs with different productions from a library, you know. Um, Again, thinking from the audience perspective, uh, if you've got a song in a score and then it goes to something else, it kind of jars, the audience to where they're thinking, oh, I'm paying attention to the music now, and
Mhm.
not, where you'd rather have, you know, it would be much easier to have like one track, one theme song, and then have various mixes or edits of that one track, which, is very easy to do and very affordable. And from there, you know, you could have a whole score off of one theme track with just different edits and, mixes.
You have
So there's
uh,
I work with all budgets, so there's ways to make it happen.
yeah.
But ultimately, you know, I hate to say, I think you should use free downloadable music instead of hiring me. But I got to be real and human about it, where it's like I want you to be an artist, and you got to do what you got to do to make your art happen, whether that's paying for a 60-piece orchestra or if that means downloading free music, you know. It's all good.
How does your experience in record production influence your work when it comes to film scoring? It's too relatable.
Um, I don't work with, well, you know, um, it helped with obviously audio, learning audio recording and stuff. And um, I had one thing that helped is I had a drummer um, who played in my metal bands. He actually was very much into classical, and he was always bringing odd instruments and percussion instruments over. And so before he'd come over, I'd think, okay, I got to look on how to mic this thing. How do you mic a marimba? you know you know or okay, he's going to bring over this big giant set of tubular bells. I got to figure out how to mic that thing. But yeah, you know obviously I don't record it, bands and live live musicians a whole lot, but all of it's helped.
What are the key elements that make a film score truly memorable and emotionally? You put that into
Um,
words.
I would say the best ones are the ones that just fit the visuals the best, I guess. The fit the emotion. My favorite oh my favorite bigger composer on films these days has always been Thomas Newman, the guy that did, The Green Mile, Shawshank Redemption, American Beauty. I liked those scores because they weren't huge and loud. They were very emotional and very they just fit the emotion of the scene so perfectly. And you don't have to have this huge epic loud sound to make an emotional impact, just a simple distant piano, he hit whatever. And that sometimes the softest, most simplest sounds bring out the most emotion, you know.
Fear less is more. What for those composers or people who are starting out in the music industry? What you have a lot of various websites geared to like artists and creators and stuff like that that have a ton of music in there. Would you even recommend them like just create something and start throwing it out there, or have your own website, or how does that work?
I always heard you got to have your own website, and I tried that for a while. Um, but you have to have a web person to update it constantly. But then I realized, well, now I have to find ways to get people to find my website, you know. So I found that it's best just to go where people are normally anyway. Um, you hear all these things where it's like, if it takes more than 2 clicks, people won't go there, you know. So you have to have your stuff out there. Um, I don't think people like to be advertised to, but have yourself out there, do enough material, put it out there, and let people easily find you. You know, you want people to easily discover you. The other thing I would say is, um, depending on what you want to do, like um, sometimes it's almost like, okay, well, I'm just basically putting my tracks in a bottle and throwing them in the ocean and seeing where they end up, you know. And I find that I use LinkedIn a lot to where it's like, for example, if I wanted to, if I did music that I thought was, you know, would sound good in a Disney cartoon, you know, I would direct my music to those people where I would put in like Disney creative director, Disney, creative producer, whatever, music supervisor for Disney, whatever. And I would click connect on those people, and then, um, those those then would be my market on who I'd want to, check out my music. More of a direct way instead of just blindly putting it out on the internet,
Yeah.
where that's what everybody else is doing as well.
Right, because I think of when I think of like stock photography, like photographers that have gotten to this, you know, AI is kind of taking over that, but stock photography, and they throw it up to, I don't know, what are the photography sites for people to
Mhm.
purchase, download, utilize their stock photography. There's tons of sites for music like that. Would you recommend any going to any of those sites? Just throwing up your music and having a library up there?
There's a lot of production libraries that people will, they'll get their music licensed on that. One thing I would do is, there's millions of production libraries out there. What I would do is I would connect with people on like people that work for the Discovery Channel or these big TV shows and say, hey, I'm just curious, where do you, where does, what libraries does this network use?
Mhm.
Again, you're being more direct towards, okay, where do I want my music to be? You know, if you're wanting it to be in film, chances are they're gonna go through music supervisors. So I would connect with as many music supervisors. You can get those names off of IMDb, or you can get them off of just watching credits of films. The great thing about, again, today is everybody's obtainable, everybody's online, so you can reach these people. There's not so much the gatekeepers. Just contact them and say, hey, I really appreciate the work that you've done on these projects. Um, you know, you know, uh, I'm available. You know, if you're ever looking for this kind of music, whatever. Um, you know, you know, these days you can directly go to the market or the people that you're trying to reach. So, yeah.
Interesting. It's yeah, actually, ironically, it reminds me. I've had that happen to me from other writers, script writers. We're like, hey, are you interested in making another film? I have a script for you. But then
Mhm.
it comes across like, well, I'm just a little guy. I'm not anyone big, but it's interesting that you're reaching out to me. So I kind of find that fascinating. Where how am I? How did they
There's
find me?
there's ways to you know, I kind of look at it like we're all artists, you know. We may be at different levels of our career, different areas in our path, but we all have different paths. But we're all artists. If you contact somebody, you know, compliment them like you're complimenting a fellow artist, you know. Don't say, I just want to say I really, really, really love your films. And if I could only work with you, that would be the greatest thrill. And, you know,
All right.
there's a difference, you know, just treat them like a normal person. Don't ask for a job. Say, hey, just want to say, I really appreciate the work that you did on such and such, you know.
Yeah.
Well, everybody likes a compliment for what they do, no matter how famous you are, you know. But I'm sure the famous people, they're constantly getting bombarded with, I would really, really wish you could hire me because that would be the greatest thing on earth if you could possibly do that, you know. And they're going to be like, no,
Yeah.
no, I don't want
Yeah.
that. Just treat them as a fellow artist.
Like what genre out of all the genres you worked with, find a genre that you haven't worked in. Is there a genre that you haven't worked in that you really wanted to work in? Want to try besides
Um,
comedy?
yeah, comedy. Yeah, I can't see myself doing that. I I think the coolest would be like sci-fi,
Mm.
because there's so many different things you could do with that. Um, I'd love to get into doing more like um, music for gaming, but
Oh yeah,
for some reason that's a totally different world.
really?
I've got a friend who he's a composer. He's trying to break in a film, but he does gaming, and I'm trying to say, hey, well, here's what we could do.
Yeah.
You know, I said, how do you get into gaming? He goes, oh, the gaming thing's easy. Getting into film, that's tough.
Oh,
I'm like,
fascinating.
nah, anybody will use your film and anybody will use your music in film, but getting into game, impossible. So um, that's another way. Um,
Yeah.
if you're wanting to um, get into a certain field, contact people that do that. And usually what I want to know is, tell me about your worst day doing that, which I would say, no matter what field of work that you do, I would want to go directly to that person that's done it for a long time and say, tell me about the worst day doing that job, you know. So,
Do you think there's when it comes to like a corporate structure, there's a lot of gatekeepers. When you do an independent film, there's less gatekeepers, maybe one gatekeeper, the director. But when you go into like a production company, how do you overcome those gatekeepers?
um, one thing I've noticed is that, you start out and it's like, well, I want to go, I want to reach those big name people or those big companies. Here's what I've kind of started noticing is that those people that do that kind of work, like, okay, well, I'm a music supervisor for this corporation, or I'm an editor for this corporation, or you know, they're I'm not saying that they're not artists, but what they do is 9 to 5 type of stuff. That's their job. So they may not be that willing to want to hear you anyway, you know. Uh, but you will meet some cool people where I've talked to bigger companies where I would contact somebody and they'd say, "Yeah, I don't have any say in that, you know. Um, that's this department. I would contact this person, you know."
They'll give you a
Which
lead.
I think's pretty cool, you know. I think that's great. Or they'll say, I had one the other day saying, "Yeah, we don't even hire composers anymore. We go through such and such library."
Mm,
Cool, you know. Now I know which libraries, you know, this big so all of that is still helpful,
mhm.
you know. And of course you know, write them back saying, I really appreciate you and all this information. Um, but it's like the indie filmmakers, they're the ones that are really passionate about all the different elements, you know. So sometimes, you know, reaching those bigger people may not be what you're really wanting to go after so much, you know, because of the fact that it's a big business, big corporation, it's ran like a machine and not so much like an artist maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So,
That's the collaboration right there.
yeah.
What is the most constructive criticism that you've ever received in your career?
Well, when I was younger, I would just dread any kind of, you know, criticism. Back when I was doing the band thing, you know, I would just cringe at, you know, record reviews, you know. And I think as you get older, you know, it's like, you know, everybody's got an opinion, and it's, um, I, I look back, there was a case where I had just released an album, our band released an album. It'd been out for a few months, and you get good reviews, some bad reviews. I remember I got notified that we were on like the top 10 uh, record charts in Paris, France, or something like that, you know, and
Wow.
I'm thinking, wow, now I'm now I'm finally starting to go somewhere. I might even be able to quit my day job, you know. Well, 5 minutes later, I open up this magazine review from I don't know, some rock magazine from New York, and I'm still like, yeah, I'm really a star now. I read their interview or their review, and it says this band sucks worse than a $10 whore. And then all of a sudden,
Oh my gosh.
I'm not going to be quitting my day job anytime soon, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like I these days I don't see it as I see it as everybody's got their own perspective, you know, and I appreciate that, you know, maybe what I do isn't for everybody, you know. It's great that not everybody likes the same thing, you know, and that there's variety. Um, I don't think they need to be that harsh about it, but uh, these days I see a lot of like screenwriters. You know, they're constantly looking for people to read their stuff, and they get everybody's telling them to revise it or change it or do something different with it. And then I'm thinking, you know, if you keep doing that, pretty soon it's no longer your own story, you know. So what I say about reviews and critics, use what you can use, you know, that will help, and disregard everything else, you know.
Yeah.
Don't change how you as the artist would create. Just pick and choose, you know, what things, you know, will help you, and not the things that will change you to the point where you're no longer you.
If someone were to direct a movie about you, what genre would your life be?
It'd be boring probably.
It's music.
On a little on the weird side, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, not a comedy then?
Yeah, maybe it would be my luck. It would be a comedy,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Mike, is
I try to
there
keep it light. Don't get too serious with it.
are you working on
Enjoy every moment.
I see that you have 5 upcoming projects. All one's in production, post-production, pre-production. Is it what are you working on next?
Um, I'm working on, well, the one thing is one thing that'll happen is that a film will come and say, "Hey, we want you to do the score." I'm like, "Okay, well, let's work on some ideas." Oh, hold off just a second. We're still working on the budget. And then I don't hear anything for about a year or two.
Mm,
I'm thinking, well, I didn't get that job. And then they come out and say, "Hey, we're ready for you." Who are you? So filmmaking is a long, long process, evidently.
is
Um, you just kind of have to be there ready when they're ready for it. Um, oh, I'm working on a number of different projects that are they'll have like pilots, or they'll do like teaser reels,
okay.
and then they're waiting for budgets to do the real thing. You know,
Interesting.
so uh, there's a there's a filmmaker that I work with. She's doing a film about her mother, who it's a historical World War II story, where basically um, she flees the Philippines and lives in the jungle for like 2 years. So
Wow.
um, yeah, so kind of a historical. I mean, I love history, especially that era. So kind of slowly working on music for that.
Do you go
And
and
then,
look at archives? Do you have to do you study the past in order to create something that will go along with that timeline?
well, like I my grandpa and his brothers were in World War II, and recently uh, my dad got a hold of a bunch of old war letters that he had written grandma. And so I mean there's a whole history of people in such a crazy era of time that had to been horrible for so many people. But and then all those people are almost gone now. And so um yeah, always been interested in history, and um, what was it like, and all the things that people went through back in their time.
Hmm. Do you go back and listen to music that was created then?
Sometimes, yeah. um Again, if I were to use like um, old music from that era, I would probably find, musicians. For example, there was a film I did years ago where it was based on the 20s. Well, luckily enough, there's this younger guy um, in the area who he does an old jazz band and dresses the part, even plays original old instruments from the 20s. So
Oh,
that was a really easy, quick fit.
yeah.
Um, I don't think I would have been able to pull that off on my own, but that was a good chance to showcase, these musicians in the era that they play in.
What I also see on your IMDb, just want to point this out. I do see a video game on there. It does say
Yeah,
pre-production.
I
Congratulations.
did some track, and it's been in pre-production for a couple years now.
Really?
So
It says
yeah,
2025.
yeah, it must still be going or something.
Well, There you go.
Honestly, I didn't even put my IMDb together. That an old client of mine did.
Nice.
So those are only a few of the films.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's
I
awesome.
don't even know how it works.
We just tag you. That's all it is.
I just every now and then something new appears on there that I did.
That's the way to do it.
So,
Yeah. What when it comes to composing, electronics, the gear, the mics, speakers, what's your favorite tech?
I've done it all with it. Um, I started doing it when before the internet came out. So my way of learning was I would go to bookstores and find anything on recording, and just had to fake my way through it and learn it, and um, it's easy nowadays, and
Sure.
occasionally I'll record a band, and it's more like a walk in the park now, just getting to do that kind of thing. But um, I like the editing actually part of it. The part that everybody else thinks is boring,
Yeah.
I really like that, like editing dialogue. For me that's relaxing. So
Interesting. What do you edit on?
I use I use Pro Tools. So
I've never used that before.
like I said, I used to go into so much debt buying studio gear and it's like, oh, I gotta have this. This just came out. I gotta have that. I can't work without that, so I'm told.
Yeah. Yeah.
And nowadays I'm more like, you know what? Like the Beatles and all those old people, they worked on way less than what we have now. You know, their studio wasn't as nearly as advanced as what we have on our phone. I've got a 24 track recorder on my phone. Um, so I'm kind of like, it's not about, again, they're just tools. It's not about the gear, it's about the idea. Because I thought, if I had like a $5 million studio, I'd still have to come up with an idea to put through the mic. So, it's still all about the idea.
I guess when you look at cast, crew, sound department, I guess what does a composer fall into? Is it are you part of the crew? Are you part of like how does that work?
Um, I guess it depends on how they look at it. Going back to, you know, well, the composer is also the mixer, also, does Foley, also does sound design. I kind of tend to look at myself as I'm just a contractor. I provide a service and,
It's a guy for
you
hire.
could tell because we're the usually the last person on the credits.
But you bring so much to the film. Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's like the theme, the emotional portion really just kind of sells it.
Uh, you know, there's so many talents, so many artists that work on a film. And you think about a film, how many years of you know, these artists have worked to make this one thing. And the music, they say, can be a big part of the film, but it's still only there to enhance the story and the characters and the feeling of the film. You know,
Yeah.
it's still, and I hear this a lot with directors, and it all starts with the story. Without that, it doesn't matter how much you spend on CGI, it just doesn't work. It has to start with the story. And a lot of directors are always telling me, when I'll say, "Well, what are you working on currently?" They'll say, "I'm just trying to find the next great story." So it all starts with the story.
Well, Mike Hall, thank you so much for being on the Down and Cat. Just to let you know, I am one of those people who actually go out and buy the film composer's soundtrack because I love it so much. And I appreciate your wisdom, your insight on being on the podcast and helping others.
Oh,
What's the
thank
best
you.
way to reach you?
Well, I think I gave you that. Um, like I said, I don't have a website other than my YouTube
SoundCloud. Are you reachable on SoundCloud and
and
YouTube?
SoundCloud. Yeah, SoundCloud will work.
Okay. All right. We'll link it in the show notes. Thanks again, Mike.
Okay.
I appreciate you.
All right. I appreciate you.